We're good, Jeremy?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for our presentation about the 2022 school department budget and also our capital bond project referendum question. I hope that I can provide a lot of information so that you can make some informed decisions. We'll give you a chance to ask questions, which we will do either at the end of the presentation, or we've turned on the chat function as well. So as questions arise, you can also use the chat function, and then at natural breaks during the presentation, scan the questions in chat, and I will respond to all of them. Okay, so I'm going to begin by sharing my screen and going through the school budget. This will be the first order of business. I'm going to give you a little bit of history first, and then tell you where we landed and what the impact is for our communities. So we're going to start by just going back in time very quickly, looking at the 2019-20 school budget. That budget was approved at $33,387,864. And in the 2020-21 school year, which is the year that we're currently in, the school committee approved a budget in May, which represented a 1.42% increase. It was for $33,861,958. Okay, so we went up from 33,387 to 33,861, 1.42% increase. As you may recall, that budget was voted down at the all-day referendum last year that was held on the last day in June. And as a result, the towns voted to level fund their contributions. And because they level funded their contributions and the state decreased their contribution, we actually had to implement a budget of $33,136,553, which represented a reduction of $725,000 from what the school committee had approved. And it also represented a reduction of about $250,000 from the previous fiscal year, from the 2019-20 budget. So in actuality, in the current school year, we are operating on $250,000 less than the prior year. So that's the history. I know that there was some concern at the time that our budget for the current school year was approved, concern about the pandemic, concern about costs related to reopening of schools. And I just am proud to report that we are within budget. We did not need to go to either of the towns for a supplemental tax request, supplemental budget request. We will end this year with a small surplus from the current year's budget, and we'll move into next year. So let's take a look at the 2021-22 budget. This is what we're looking at for approval at the April 12th all-day referendum. Okay, so I'm in column V here, which I'm highlighting. The initial, this is not what the school committee landed on, but when all of the department heads and all of the administrators put their requests in for the budget for next school year, the total amount of requests was $34,616,726. That represented almost a $1.5 million increase over the prior year, meaning what we're operating on this year, which is a 4.47% increase. It is a 2.23% increase over what we requested last year, and it's just under a 4% increase over the FY20. So the initial draft was at $34,616,726. Without going into all the details about what we go through, the process we go through to reduce our budget. But it's a pretty lengthy process to make sure that we capture the needs and that we take advantage of as many efficiencies as possible. We also look at staffing changes, retirements, and all of the savings that go along with that. What we landed on was a budget of $33,701,225. But before I plug that in and show you the impact, I want to just bring your attention down to the bottom and talk about the way that this budget is distributed to the two towns. So the budget is actually, the town responsibility for the budget is actually distributed to the two towns based on the proportion of children from the two towns that are enrolled in our schools on October 1st of the prior year. So October 1st of this school year determines what the apportionment numbers will be for Exeter and for West Greenwich for the next school year's budget. As you know, we are living in a pandemic, and one of the implications that we saw is that the population actually shifted quite significantly because, in part, we had a number of children in the earliest grades, preschool and kindergarten. Those are not mandatory grades for schooling, according to the law. A number of families chose not to send their children into school. So we have a reduction in our overall population, but it was heavily skewed in the direction of West Greenwich, meaning that many West Greenwich residents who typically send their children to preschool and kindergarten chose not to. And as a result, the population of the kids that are actually enrolled changed significantly in favor of West Greenwich, meaning they had a lower percentage of children attending, and Exeter actually had a greater percentage of children attending. So in the prior year, Exeter is first. So in the prior year, Exeter had 46.25% of the student population. And this year, it's 48.1% of the population. It's almost a 2% shift, which in a $30+ million budget is quite a significant number. And then West Greenwich prior year had a 53.75% portion of the student enrollment, and this year it went to 51.9%. And again, that shift is at least partially related to the decrease in enrollment, and that decrease was heavily skewed in the direction of West Greenwich. We did an analysis, and I just want to show you this, that based on predicted enrollment for preschool and kindergarten, if the numbers stayed consistent with the trend that we've seen over the past many years, we made the adjustment, and we would have expected that the Exeter proportion of children would have been at 47.4%, and West Greenwich would have been at 52.6%. So it doesn't represent the full shift, but it certainly represents a good portion of it. Again, that's just based on pandemic non-enrollment for the earliest grades, pre-K and K. With the current percentages, the actuals, that original number, which is not the number we landed on, would have resulted in an Exeter percent change of what they would have to contribute of 10.23%, and a West Greenwich increase of only 2.17%. That's because there was a huge shift in population. So this is not the result of the increase in the budget. In total, most of it in Exeter is due to the population shift. So if I just plug in what we would have anticipated, just so that you can see, 46.25%. And 53.75%. This is what we would have expected if we had preschool and kindergarten enrollment that modeled the trends that we saw over the past several years, it would have been roughly a 6% increase for each town, roughly. Okay. Again, this is not where we ended up, but I just want to show you that that population shift certainly made a huge difference in those original numbers that you saw. So I'm going to play this out with those percentages so you can see what it would have been, and then I'm going to plug the new percentages back in so you can see what it actually is based on the enrollment. All right. So again, 34,616,726 was the initial draft. What we landed on and what the school committee approved was 33,701,235. So we knocked out just over $900,000 in requests. I'm going to take you down to the bottom and see what this does. Again, if the population distribution was what we predicted based on prior year enrollments. Oh, this is the prior year. This is if everything stayed exactly the same. Prior year 46.25 and 53.75. I'll show you all the percentages in a moment, but you can see what happened here to the percentages. Additionally, the school committee authorized revenues that would offset the impact to the town. So we are taking $250,000 out of our fund balance. You can take a look at what that would do to the percentages for the two towns. The school committee also authorized an additional $164,948 from a post-employment benefit reserve account. That is an additional revenue, which reduces the impact on the two towns. See what's happening. This would represent just a 1% increase for Exeter and a 0.85% increase for West Greenwich. And finally, we have an increase in the tuition students that are coming into our school district. We have several career and technical education programs that are state approved. And we do allow, as all high schools do, we allow students from other towns to enter our programs if we have space. We have an increase for next school year, and our tuition intake will be $230,571, which is about a $41,000 increase in revenue there. So if the populations stayed exactly as they were in the prior year, our budget would only call for a 0.87% increase to Exeter and a 0.7% increase to West Greenwich, which is very reasonable given the costs related to reopening and so forth. Let me show you what would happen if we plugged in what we expected to see, and this is based on the preschool and kindergarten enrollment. So because there was still a shift, this would have produced an increase for Exeter of 3.38%, while West Greenwich would see a decrease in their contribution. So the contribution from West Greenwich is definitely going to go down because of the significant population shift. Again, this is if the preschool and K enrollment stayed consistent with trends over the past several years. But what we actually have is a massive population shift. And Exeter is at 48.1%. West Greenwich is at 51.9%. So where the school committee landed, it means that the Exeter increase is 4.91%, and the West Greenwich is seeing a decrease of 2.77%. So if the population shift did not happen, if the proportion of children from the two towns stayed consistent, each town would have seen a less than 1% increase. But because of the population shift, which is defined by the charter, the impact to the two towns is very skewed. So we went from an initial draft that was over 10% to Exeter to a 4.91% increase for next school year. We also know that as we are coming out of the pandemic, we're expecting to see the preschool and kinder enrollments rise again. And as a result, we're expecting a shift in the opposite direction next year. So once the preschool and kindergarten enrollments go back to normal, the following school year, which will be based on October 1st of next school year, the following school year budget will see an increase in the population of children from West Greenwich and a decrease in the population of children from Exeter. So while Exeter goes up this year and West Greenwich goes down, we would expect to see the complete opposite occur next school year when our enrollment goes back to normal. So that is just a little bit of extra information based on the circumstances of our time. So this is the budget that was approved by the school committee. Again, I want to just bring your attention to this. It does represent a 1.7% increase, which is the lowest that I've seen from school districts that have submitted their budgets to the town for approval, either at an all-day referendum or a town financial meeting. 1.7%. It is actually almost 0.5% less than what we requested last year and what was initially approved by the school committee last year. And it is under a 1% increase as compared to the school year that was 1920. Okay, so in 1920, we had a budget. 2021, it went down, as I explained. And this budget that we're presenting for next school year is less than 1% more than what it was in FY20. And because the school committee has authorized using revenues to offset the impact on the two towns, even though we have a 1.7% increase to the prior year, in total, it only represents a 0.78% increase in the contribution from the two towns. The problem is that it is distributed in a very uneven way, which has nothing to do with the budget. It has to do with the way that the apportionment is calculated based on the enrollment of children as defined by the charter. So I just want to be clear about that. And then what I also wanted to do is take you through an exercise just so that you could see what would happen if our budget was not approved at the all-day referendum on April 12th. So we know that the school year that we're currently in, our budget was not approved at the all-day referendum. So I'm going to take you through the steps that happened this year and assume that the exact same things happen next year. What that would mean is we removed from our operating budget the school resource officer. So that was taken out of the operations budget. So I've simply taken what the school committee approved for this year and removed the total cost of salary and benefits for the school resource officer and reduced our operating budget to $33,578,727. I've built in what the school committee assigned from their fund balance. I've built in the post-employment benefit reserve authorization from the school committee. I've built in the added tuition. We're also looking at the populations as they are, 48.1 and 51.9. And if the two towns had to level fund their contribution, which is what they did in the current school year, then this was the contribution of Exeter and this was the contribution of West Greenwich, so it stays consistent. It means that the total contribution would be $26,704,936. The problem is that even with taking out the SRO, the school resource officer, we would need from the town's $26,759,958 plus the $156,815 to pay for the bonds that we currently have. It means that we would have to cut an additional $211,000 from the budget on top of the school resource officer in order to get it to a place where we could balance our budget based on an equal contribution from the two towns. So if the budget is voted down, we know that we have to make an additional almost $212,000 worth of cuts. Even if that happens, the two towns, if they do exactly what they did this year, would split the cost of the SRO outside of the school budget. And it means that the Exeter contribution would still go up $510,077 just because of the population shift. And the West Greenwich contribution would go down $510,000 as a result of the population shift. When you add in the SRO cost, which is what they did this year, the Exeter contribution would be $571,326, which represents a 4.61% increase. If the budget is voted down, the Exeter contribution is still 4.61%. We are at 4.91%. It is roughly a $30,000 differential between, or $38,000 differential between approving the budget and not approving the budget. And it's based on the shift in population, which is defined by our charter. So there's nothing that we really can do to offset that unless we change the charter. And the West Greenwich contribution would go down by $448,828 as opposed to the $399,240 that it will go down under the approved school committee budget. So I thought this was an important exercise just to show that there really is not a significant difference between approval and non-approval in terms of the impact on the two towns. And it's all because of population shift. Okay, so I am going to stop there. Here are the numbers, right? So the Exeter, this is the difference between passing and failing at the all-day referendum. Exeter's contribution would go down by about $37,000 and West Greenwich would go down by about $50,000. So the total reduction based on not approving the budget would be just $86,000. And on top of that, we would also have to cut $212,000 in additional programs. So it would be pretty devastating for us. All right, I'm going to stop there and take some time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing, although I will share again if I need to. I'll check out the chat. I don't see anything. So we'll give people a couple of minutes if you have questions to plug them into the chat. Or Jeremy, what are the rules for people who want to ask who are on their phones?
We don't have anybody dialed in from their phone, but if they were, they'd hit *9 to raise their hand and *6 to unmute. I'm also monitoring the chat on YouTube, and I don't see any questions there either. But if any come up, I'll let you know.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. I'll give it a minute in case people are typing. It's a pretty complex process that we try to explain in a half hour, but I can imagine that it's difficult to follow. So I'm happy to answer questions, and if people have them even later on, just feel free to plug them into the chat and I can go back to this presentation later. All right, so why don't I talk a little bit about the bond next, and then we can open up for questions again after that. Okay, so this is a copy of a flyer that was produced that is actually being mailed out to every single household in both Exeter and West Greenwich this week. I know that we are finalizing that, the prepping of that mailing tomorrow. It'll get to the post office likely tomorrow afternoon, and it will be in residents' mailboxes sometime later in this week. But this is a 2-page flyer that really tells a lot about what we're trying to do with the capital improvement bond that we're seeking approval of on the April 12th ballot. So you might recall that in 2000, well, it was after 2017, there was the state actually asked for a report on the condition of all schools in the state of Rhode Island. And that report indicated hundreds of millions of dollars of improvements across the state in school buildings that are in disrepair, in need of improvement. In Exeter, West Greenwich, we had over $40 million worth of improvements that report indicated were necessary. Shortly after that report came out, the state put on the ballot authorization of a $250 million school facility bond that was approved by the voters across the state. And what that does is it allows schools to pursue improvements in their facilities using the funding that was approved through the statewide bond, and incentives were built in for districts so that it was really pushing us to try to take advantage of these extra incentives, which would reduce the impact of the cost of improvements on the taxpayers. We have not done that since that $250 million bond was approved, but we are seeking approval at this April 12th all-day referendum. So we have a bond of $17.8 million. Again, the report identified 40 million. We did a lot of conversations and negotiations with the towns to get to a place where we're all in agreement that this $17.8 million worth of projects are necessary. They are improvements that will need to be done one way or the other. And we can either do it while we have the opportunity to take advantage of additional incentive funding that would be reimbursed to us and lower the cost to the taxpayers, or if we wait, those additional incentives may no longer be available. And those projects would need to be done, but the cost to the taxpayers would actually be more. So we feel that it is our responsibility to do this now while we can take advantage of the maximum amount of reimbursement from the state. The biggest project that's included is the HVAC system at the junior senior high school. The junior senior high was built and opened, was built prior to and opened up in 1990. The HVAC system is original. Therefore, it is over 30 years old. It has exceeded its life expectancy, so to speak. And we are spending lots of money each year, making sure that we do Band-Aid improvements to keep it running. But that is becoming increasingly more challenging to do. So that would be the first project, which is more than a $4 million cost just to replace the HVAC system. It would be the first project that we did, and we would be ready to break ground on that project this coming spring into the summer and get it ready for before the cold weather came next school year. We also have identified several other things, and I just want to highlight what they are. We have a greenhouse at the senior high school. Again, it's over 25 years old, constant attention and repair. We have an agricultural science program. That's a career and technical program at our high school. It allows us to tuition children in, so it is a revenue source. But our current greenhouse is it's on its last leg, and that will require it requires us to just knock down and replace. Again, that greenhouse will go at some point in the near future. We'll have to repair it and replace it anyway. This gives us the opportunity to do it while we qualify for incentives. Our senior high school science labs are original. Again, the building opened in 1990. They are not adequate for optimal learning right now, and they also are not up to code with all of the current requirements. We are grandfathered in based on the year that they were built, but they are not up to code at current time. Our senior high school auditorium as well was cited for safety and programmatic upgrades in our recent NEASC accreditation visit. It was also part of the Jacobs report. That was the commissioned report from the state that identified areas of need in all of the facilities across the state. And so there are areas that need to be addressed, not only in terms of safety, but acoustics, sound, lighting, those kinds of things. We have included the Wawaloon Playground, which anybody that has had children at Wawaloon, the location is not a very safe location. There are steps, it's on a hill. It is not accessible for all children, for children with disabilities, so it doesn't meet ADA requirements. This would be moved to a different location on the campus. It would be updated and it would be accessible. So those are some of the projects. We also have the roofs at the two elementary schools. So Metcalf and Wawaloon, again, those roofs are at the last stage of their expected life. Every time we have a windstorm, we're replacing shingles. We have leaks in some areas of the two buildings, so those roofs need to be replaced as well. There are some other projects such as ceilings and some floors and so forth, but those are the big projects that we are looking to take care of in this bond. So let's take a look at what the impact would be. The total project is $17,800,000. Because we're a regional school district, all of the capital projects that we do, we automatically get 61% reimbursement from the state. So for every $1 million we spend, the state gives us $610,000 or 61%, and then the taxpayers will take care of the rest, which in that case would be $390,000. So for every $1 million spent, the state reimburses us $610,000. The taxpayers contribute $390,000. That equals $1 million. Under this, under the incentives that are in place right now, we could receive up to 15% in additional reimbursements by meeting some of the incentive requirements. So for example, if you do a project that addresses warm, safe, and dry health and safety issues, like the HVAC system, like the roofs, that qualifies for an additional 5% reimbursement. We have also proposed some educational enhancements, like the greenhouse, like the science labs. That would qualify for an additional 5% reimbursement. We are actually, we anticipate that we could be approved for up to 15% in additional incentives, meaning that our reimbursement could go from 61%, which is standard, to 76%, because we would qualify for these incentives under the state bond. That means for every $1 million we spend, we could be seeing $760,000 from the state, $240,000 from the community for each $1 million that we spend. This is a lot of money. That's an extra $150,000 per million that we spend that the taxpayers would not have to contribute. Those incentives begin to expire if the projects are not started by December of 2022. So we have the rest of this year, all of next school year, and half of the school year after to make sure that these projects have begun so that we can qualify for as many of these incentives as possible. And that's why we're looking for approval now before it's too late. What we've done is we've done a calculation just to show you what this means for a $17.8 million project. And we assumed that we would only be getting 66% reimbursement. So 61% is guaranteed. We know that we have the potential of earning 15% in bonuses, but we don't want to overpromise. So we did this calculation based on if we only got one of those additional bonuses. And I don't think we're only going to get one, but if we only got one, it would be a 66%, 61 plus an extra 5, 66% reimbursement from the state, and the community would pick up the rest. So a $17.8 million project would get us $11,748,000 from the state, and the taxpayers would pay $6,052,000. So $17.8 million worth of projects, total cost to the district, to the community, $6.052 million. Okay. Let's talk about the money. So what that means for us is that in 21-22, or the first year of the project, the way that the current draft of the bond schedule looks, and we would have to finalize this after the town approves this bond. But the way the bond schedule looks, in the first year, the impact would be $189,375, which, if we break it out to the two towns, is roughly $89,000 expense for Exeter and roughly $100,000 expense for West Greenwich. And that's based on a 47%, 53% share of the student population, because that's the way the charter reads. So we would get all of these projects, and it would cost an additional $89,000 to one town, $100,000 to the other town. In the second year of the project, it would go up to $378,750, which doubles. It would cost the town an extra $89,000 in Exeter, an extra $100,000 in West Greenwich. And then from that point forward, the bond payment is fairly stable at $378,750. It is exactly that in the next school year. It fluctuates a very, very small amount in the years that follow, but it is fairly consistent, roughly the same $380,000, $390,000, and the impact to the towns would be fairly insignificant on a $30+ million budget. So it's the first 2 years that you have to step into the bond payment, and the impact to the two towns would be roughly $89,000 in Exeter for 2 consecutive years, roughly $100,000 in West Greenwich for 2 consecutive years. Then it is built into the annual budget, and there is no further increase that would be required for the length of this 20-year bond. So we would get all this work done for $89,000 for 2 years, $100,000 for 2 years. Obviously, we're paying this amount every year, but in terms of an increase from year to year, which impacts the increases to the two towns, it's only a 2-year step into the final bond amount, which stays pretty consistent after year 2. And I will say too that we did these calculations based on these numbers, which, as I said, are done very conservatively based on a 61% plus 1 incentive of an additional 5%, so 66% state and 34% town. If we qualified for additional bonuses, maybe up to 15%, then the state reimbursement would go up, the town share would go down, and the amount of the bond would also go down. So this is worst case scenario based on everything that we know. And we could potentially qualify for a lot more in state reimbursement, which would actually lower this amount for the first 2 years. So again, some pictures, dated science labs. We're also addressing the parking lot at the senior high school, the roofs at our 2 elementaries, the HVAC system, which is the big project, the auditorium I talked about, the playground, which requires you to climb up these stairs. These are kindergarten and first grade students. The stairs are crumbling. It's on a hill. It's not accessible. The greenhouse is on its last leg. So we know that we would qualify for the health and safety bonus, but we have additional things that we're doing that we believe would help us qualify for additional incentives. And our timeline is as follows. We have approval at the RIDE level, at the Department of Ed level, for our proposals. The bond referendum is on April 12th. We are looking at the junior senior high school HVAC construction as our very first significant project. We would move into roofs, playground, parking, and auditorium projects at the junior senior high school. And then in 2022, January, February of 2022, completing the roof and the parking and auditorium projects, then going into the Wawalum playground. And we would have everything completed before that December 22, or at least it would be started by December of 2022, which would allow us to qualify for the maximum in incentive bonuses from the state, according to their timeline that I described here. But if they're not started by December of 22, then we do not qualify for those incentives. So we've constructed a timeline that would allow us to qualify for the maximum amount of incentives. So in general, we know that these projects are required. We want to do them at a time where we can maximize the incentives from the state, which would therefore lower the contribution from the 2 towns. And if we don't get approval, these projects will need to be done at some point in the very near future, at a time when those incentives are no longer available, and it would cost the taxpayers more. So we're trying to do this in the most responsible way and create the least amount of impact on our 2 towns. That's a lot of information as well. These flyers have been produced. They are going in the mail this week, and every community household will receive one. So if there are any questions on this, I'm happy to answer them as well. And if any questions come up between now and the all-day referendum, you can always feel free to reach out to me at the school, and I'd be happy to answer as well. All right, so I'm going to look in the chat. Jeremy, our technology director, has included a place where you can go see additional information. I'm going to put my email address in the chat as well. You can feel free to reach out anytime with questions. That's what I have. So I'll just open up the floor if there's any comments, any questions.
I have a question from YouTube.
Okay.
So to sum up the school budget, not approving the budget would save roughly $35,000, but would trigger a much larger amount in cuts, 200,000 plus?
Correct. That is 100% correct. And again, it's because we've really, really consolidated the budget to have the least amount of impact possible given the circumstances of our time. We know there's a lot of families that are struggling, but what we cannot control for is the shift in the population, which was partially caused by students not enrolling in the early childhood grades because they didn't have to. It's not the law. And that skewed the overall percentage of students from the 2 towns. That shift in population created the bulk of the increase to Exeter. And it also created a decrease in the contribution from West Greenwich. But that is a result of the way that the town shares are calculated, which is defined by the charter. It is not the result of us asking for tons and tons and tons of new money. In fact, what we asked for this year is less than what we had approved at the school committee level last year. And when we had in our current operating budget, I know I've shared this information, but I think it's worth saying again. The only way that we were able to balance this year's budget, which was a reduction from the prior year, is that we had some teachers that teach like art at the elementary school, a music teacher at an elementary school, who put in for leaves of absences so that they could stay home with their children. We did not replace those teachers. So none of our elementary children this year are getting art instruction. There is no music instruction at Wawaloon. The teachers are on leave of absence. Some of them are doing work with the National Guard to manage the pandemic. We just didn't replace them. And that allowed us to get to the budget that we had to get to based on the result of the all-day referendum. We also saw some savings in areas like sports, because certain sports could not run based on the pandemic rules. Seasons were shortened, so we had fewer buses, fewer competitions. There are savings that we experienced in a variety of ways. We also had increased costs, but we managed the increased costs with the savings from the prior year when we shut down for 3 months. And we knew that we were getting stimulus money, which we did, and we used that stimulus money to address all of the increased costs. That's why we have not gone to the two towns for a supplemental budget, and that was something that the community was basically told was going to happen, not by us, but the community was told that that was likely to happen. It did not happen, and we're really proud of that. Because we have those teachers that are on leave of absence, for example, because we had savings in sports, for example, all of those things are put back into the budget for next year. And we still have an increase that is very small, at less than 1% over the prior year, because we've worked really hard to really limit our requests, based on the fact that we know several of our community members are struggling. There's a lot of families across the country and across the state that are struggling as a result of the pandemic. So yes, it's a long answer, but at the end of the day, not approving this saves about $35,000 and results in $211,000 more of cuts. And that would absolutely be programs.
There's another. I pasted the next question into the chat, so you could just read it.
Further approval of the bond would trigger 66% additional funds from the state for repairs that must be done eventually anyway. If we miss the bond deadline, taxpayers would have to pay for 100%. So let me clarify that. There's a little bit of a difference in what you state from what is actual. No matter when we do the projects, we will always qualify for 61% reimbursement from the state. We will, because we're a regional school district, that's our reimbursement rate. So if we do a project, the taxpayers pay 39%, the state pays 61%. That's our standard baseline reimbursement. Every school district has a reimbursement rate. Ours is among the highest in the state, and it is because we're regional, and that was one of the benefits of becoming regional. So 61% is guaranteed. What we would miss out on is anything above the 61%. So we projected our costs, assuming that we only qualify for one of the bonuses. We believe that we could qualify for 3 of the bonuses. So our reimbursement could go from 61% all the way up to 75%, roughly 75%. An additional $150,000 of reimbursement for every million that we spend is our potential. Those bonuses go away if the projects are not started by December of 2022. So yes, these projects will eventually need to be done anyway. These are repairs for things that have gone beyond their life expectancy. And just like in anybody's house, at some point you have to replace your roof. At some point you have to replace your hot water heater. These things they need to be replaced. We know that these projects will need to be done. If we don't get them approved, and if they're not started by December of 22, then instead of getting 75% reimbursement from the state, which is our maximum potential, we would only get 61% from the state. It's still a difference of about $150,000 for every million, which is a lot of money. So we want to take advantage of that. The taxpayers would never have to pay 100%, but they would have to pay the difference between our baseline 61% reimbursement rate and the 100%. If we qualify for the bonuses, they only have to pay the difference between potentially 75% reimbursement and the 100%. So it's a significant amount of money. But you're right, these projects are not going away. They will need to be done. I'd rather do them now than in a case of an emergency. If that HVAC system dies in the middle of the winter time, not only are we replacing the HVAC system, but we would be relocating students, having to rent a different place, additional transportation. I mean, it could be a real nightmare unless we get it done now before it actually completely fails to the point of non-repair. So the cost would only go up from the current estimates in an emergency situation if we didn't plan for it.
That's all I have from YouTube.
Okay. All right. Any other questions from people that are on? Feel free to use the chat, unmute, just shout out your question, comment. Jeremy, let me know if you see any more from YouTube. Okay, so I have put my contact information in the chat. It's my first name, James _ Erinakis, ERINAKES, at ewg.k12.ri.us. You can email me anytime with questions if you have, if you want some time to really digest this. And if you think of a question later tonight, you can always email it to me and I will certainly get back to you with a response. The all-day referendum is scheduled for April 12th. That mailing has gone out. We will send out additional reminders. It's an all-day vote at the 2 town halls. And on the ballot is the school department budget and then a separate question for the bond. So you should have already received one mailing. The bond flyer is going out to every household this week. And then we will continue to communicate with our families with the same information, but just with reminders about the vote. Super important that we have as many people vote as possible. And we want to make sure that you have all the information you need to make the best informed decision. Hopefully that means you'll support our schools, but the most important thing is to get out and vote. Okay. All right, that's all I have. So I'll look forward to additional questions and fingers crossed for the results on April 12th. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate your time.